Sits there, the old man, on that dock like he's got nowhere better to be and no reason to hurry toward it. Constable Yves Tremblay leaned against the hood of his cruiser, arms crossed, watching the figure at the end of the long wooden pier. Sergeant Adeline Poulin stood beside him, her eyes moving between the water and the tree line and back again. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The town of Lac Miroir, Quebec, sat at the base of the Laurentian Highlands, and in November it looked exactly like what it was. A place that had long since decided the rest of the world could sort itself out without it. Every morning, Tremblay said, his breath fogging in the cold. Rain, snow, doesn't matter. 6 a.m., he's out there. The man on the dock was named Walter Brooke, 71 years old, white-haired, broad-shouldered, in the way of men who were once very strong, and had simply compressed with age, rather than softened. He held a fishing rod that he rarely baited. He watched the lake the way other men watched a fire. Not for what it showed him, but for what it helped him think. You think he even knows what's going on up the mountain? Tremblay asked. He exhaled slowly. He knows. Everybody from here to Saint Donat knows, as whether he cares. Up on the ridge above Lac Miroir, a situation had been developing for 36 hours that had consumed every law enforcement resource in 3 counties. A group of armed survivalists, 7 men calling themselves something that sounded reasonable in a manifesto and ugly in practice, had occupied a decommissioned forestry camp 12 kilometers into the backcountry, in with a cache of weapons, a grievance about federal land registry decisions. And they had taken with them, apparently as an afterthought, a provincial land assessor named Gilles, who had simply been doing his job when they crossed paths on a logging road. The RCMP had established a perimeter. The Sûreté du Québec had sent negotiators. Advisors had arrived from Ottawa with laptops and acronyms. And the situation on the ridge, as of 6 this morning, had not moved a single centimeter. Inspector Claude Fontaine, the federal liaison, who had driven up from Montreal the previous afternoon, found the stillness of the man on the dock professionally offensive so. He was 44, precise, officer carried, and carried the particular confidence of someone who had been promoted quickly enough that he had never had cause to doubt himself. Already reorganized the command post twice, requisitioned equipment that wouldn't arrive for another day, and managed to alienate the local RCMP corporal. Within the first hour, walked to where Poulin and Tremblay stood. That's the property owner adjacent to the access trail? He asked, nodding toward the dock. Walter Brooke, Poulin confirmed. Retired. Lives alone. As for about 12 years. He needs to clear the area. If we're moving equipment through that trail access tonight, and I can't have a civilian rattling around back there. Fontaine's French was Parisian-inflected, which in this part of Quebec landed somewhere between amusing and irritating. I'll go speak with him. Tremblay said nothing. He had known Walter Brooke for 9 years. He had helped the man pull a neighbor's truck out of the ditch one February without being asked. Had seen him spend an entire Saturday repairing the roof of the church hall after a windstorm, asking for nothing and saying little. He had also once seen the man catch a 16-year-old breaking into a car in the IGA parking lot and hold him. Calmly, completely, just one hand. Until Tremblay arrived. The kid had been 6'1" and 40 pounds heavier than Walter. They had looked mildly inconvenienced. Good luck, was all Tremblay said. Fontaine walked down to the dock, his city shoes loud on the old boards. Walter didn't turn around. Mr. Brooke, Fontaine stopped a few feet behind him. I'm Inspector Fontaine, federal liaison for the current operation in this area. I need to inform you that this property falls within the security buffer we've established. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate temporarily. There's a situation developing that. I know what's developing. Walter's voice was even and unhurried, like water running under ice. Gilles Parenteau. They took him up near the old Couture camp and paused. How do you know the hostage's name? Because I know everybody in this valley. Walter reeled in his line slightly, adjusted the rod. His daughter plays piano at the church. Odd. His wife makes tourtière. That's better than anyone else's in the municipality. A decent man who was doing a job and ran into people who are scared and making it everyone else's problem. Be that as it may, I'm not leaving. I said it the way a man states a fact about weather. You can ask me, or you can make it complicated. Either way, same answer. Fontaine's jaw tightened. Sir, I understand this is your home. Are armed individuals less than 15 kilometers from where we're standing? This is not a request I'm making lightly. Walter turned then, slowly, and looked at the inspector directly. Fontaine was a man who had conducted interrogations, had sat across from serious people in serious rooms. But something in the older man's gaze made him stop mid-breath. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't contempt. Something far more disconcerting. A kind of complete, encompassing patience, as though Fontaine were a minor problem that time would resolve on its own. Those men on the ridge, Walter said, are running a Soviet-era frequency scrambler. Modified, but I'd recognize the architecture from a kilometer away. Their communications have been compromised since last night. You're not getting a clear read on their positions because they're feeding false signals into your net. He paused, because you're not going to resolve this by morning the way you're set up. Fontaine stared at him. How could you possibly know what equipment there? Walter had already turned back to the lake. Mr. Brooke, go run your operation, Inspector. I'll be here. Fontaine walked back up the dock. His footsteps, going back, were not quite as certain as they had been coming down. Pullen watched him return. She said nothing, which in her opinion was the professional thing to do. He refused and said, though it came out sounding more like a question. Yes, said Pullen. Mentioned our communications disruption, our comms situation is classified. Pullen looked at him steadily. Then perhaps you should wonder how he knew. At the command post, inside the Lac Miroir Community Center, the situation was deteriorating in the specific grinding way that situations deteriorate when there are too many people with authority and not enough with knowledge. Communications tech named Bergeron had spent 6 hours trying to establish a clean channel to the negotiating team on the ridge and had managed it for approximately 40 seconds before the signal dissolved into static and false positives again. Our net, Bergeron said, for the third time. Whatever they're running, it's not off the shelf. It's pushing phantom signals into the frequency band. Yes, I'm seeing movement indicators for teams that aren't moving. Fontaine stood over the maps, his composure beginning to show hairline fractures. He had brought federal resources, federal equipment, authority. None of it was working. The mountain sat above them, indifferent, and Gilles Parenteau had been up there for a day and a half. Sergeant Pullen stood near the door. She kept thinking about what Walter Brooke had said. Soviet-era architecture, a sûreté officer for 18 years. She knew what a man who guessed looked like. He hadn't been guessing. She had run his name through the system when he first moved to Lac Miroir 9 years ago. The search had returned a standard civilian record. Some Ontario addresses, a Quebec driver's license, a property deed. Clean. Unremarkable. The kind of record that, looked at it a certain way, was almost too clean. Almost too unremarkable. She had noticed it at the time and filed it away in the back of her mind where things went, when they didn't have anywhere better to be. She went back to the dock. Walter was still there. Fletcher had dropped. He hadn't moved. Can I ask you something? She said, sitting down on an overturned crate near the dock's edge. You can ask. What did you do before you came here? A long pause. Ake made small sounds against the pilings. Different things, he said. Retirement's a funny age for a man to end up somewhere like this, she said. No family, no community connections before you arrived. Paid cash for the property, as that go back about as far as they need to and not much further. Walter glanced at her sideways. There was something in his expression that might, in the right light, have been respect. Sharper than your inspector, he said. Most people are, she said. Walter, those men on the ridge, they'd recognize the communication architecture. That's not something a civilian says. The fishing rod rested across his knees. He looked at the far shore, the dark line of spruce against a white sky. I'm a civilian now, he said. I know, she said. But you weren't always. He was quiet for a long time. A merganser crossed the far side of the lake, low and fast. Walter tracked it without appearing to. Your command post, he said, finally. Your inspector doesn't authorize any movement on the ridge before full dark. If he sends people up that trail in daylight, with the comm situation the way it is, he's going to get someone hurt. She stood up. And after dark? Walter didn't answer. He had already turned back to the water. She went back. She delivered the message about the daylight movement. Fontaine argued, "C'est unnoticed." She held the line with the specific patience of a woman who had learned that being right and winning the argument were two different things, and that the second one wasn't always necessary. She said she had a local source with knowledge of the terrain. She did not say anything more than that. The afternoon stretched and grayed. At 3 o'clock, a sheater on the ridge reported that the group had stopped responding. At 4, a secondary contact attempt failed. At 4:30, Fontaine authorized a drone flight that returned footage so corrupted by signal interference it was effectively useless. At dusk, Constable Tremblay went down to check on Walter. The dock was empty. The house was dark. The truck was still in the gravel drive. But the house felt different. Not empty the way a house feels when someone's gone out, but occupied in a different mode, Odie, like a room where something careful and quiet was happening behind the closed door. I radioed Poulin. He's inside. No lights. Leave him, she said. Should I be concerned? She thought about it. About Walter? No. Inside the house, Walter Brooke moved through the dark without hesitation or error. He had lived in this house for 12 years and he knew it the way he knew his own hands. By memory and by feel. He went to the back room, the one he called the study, and which contained, to anyone who looked at it, several shelves of books, a workbench for fly tying, and a wooden cabinet that might have held tools. He opened the cabinet with a key he kept on his person at all times. Inside the cabinet was a second door. He entered a 5-digit code on a recessed pad. Not electronic, mechanical, the kind that didn't need power and didn't leave a digital signature. The door opened, and what was behind it did not belong in a fisherman's house in the Laurentians. He did not look at it with excitement or nostalgia. He looked at it the way a surgeon looks at instruments before a procedure. Checking condition, confirming readiness, feeling the familiar weight of purpose settle back onto shoulders that had carried it before, and still remembered how. Communications equipment was military grade, Canadian Forces specification, modified over the years by hands that knew what they were doing. It was not cutting edge. It was better than cutting edge. It was proven. The kind of equipment that had worked in conditions where failure was not an acceptable outcome. He sat down. He put on the headset. He did not turn it on. Immediately. He breathed, learned to breathe like this in a different life. Slow, controlled. The kind of breath that slows the heart rate and clears the mind of everything except what is directly in front of it. It learned it somewhere cold and serious, a long time ago, from men who did not use many words, because words were a resource like any other, and you didn't waste resources. About Gilles Parenteau, a man he knew by name and by the smell of his wife's cooking at the church potluck. A man who had gone to work one morning and found himself in the middle of something he had no part in starting. He powered on the set. The static was immediate and familiar. He had missed it, in the way you miss a language you used to speak, not consciously, not with longing, but with a kind of cellular recognition when you hear it again. He began working the dial. He was not looking for a frequency. He was listening for the shape of the silence between frequencies, the specific texture of suppressed signals, the rhythm of a jammer that thought it was invisible. He had spent a portion of his professional life designing systems like the one currently running on that ridge. He had also spent a portion of his professional life taking them apart. He found the carrier wave in 11 minutes, narrow, disciplined, running just beneath the noise floor. The work of someone who knew what they were doing, but who was running old doctrine in a new environment and hadn't accounted for certain variables. It fine-tuned. The signal resolved. It was a protocol he recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in decades. Instantly, completely, from the first 3 notes. He pressed the transmit key. As Horde, his voice when it came out was not Walter Brooks' voice. It was a tool, size flat, stripped of everything personal. King Post, this is Ridgeline. Authentication is Charlie Tango 77. I say again, Charlie Tango 77. Do you copy? Static. He waited. Seconds. 30. He was preparing to repeat when the reply came back. Young. Uncertain. With the specific tension of someone who has just received information they don't know what to do with. Identified station. You are on a restricted channel. Identify and authenticate immediately. Get your senior signals officer, Walter said. Tell them Ridgeline is on the net with a Charlie Tango authentication. Tell them to check their legacy files, and tell them to hurry. They've got a man on that ridge who'd like to come home. He released the key. He waited, Mare. He was patient in the way that men are patient when they have learned that patience is not the same as passivity. It is simply the correct allocation of energy before action. It was 4 minutes. When the voice returned, it was a different voice. Older, steadier. A voice that had spent time in rooms where the stakes were real. Ridgeline, authentication confirmed. FU. Wait one. Not a question, an acknowledgement. Walter leaned back slightly. He knew what was happening on the other end of that transmission, as he could picture it without effort. A signals officer pulling up records that were flagged in a way that meant they didn't get pulled up often. Alfredy fields. A call upward through a chain of command that moved faster when certain codes appeared. A conversation that began with confusion and ended with urgency. The voice that came back the 3rd time was different again. Operational, focused, just his own dusty fields. With the quiet authority of a man who was in the middle of coordinating something and had just added another thread to the pattern without losing the rest of it. Ridgeline. We have your authentication. That's your situation. Walter pressed the key. Have eyes on the AO. Your topographic data is 12 years out of date. The logging road marked as the primary access has washed out at the second switchback. Impassable for vehicles. Effery quealed. The trail that runs behind the Brook property, my property, is not on your maps, but it runs to within 400 meters of the target site under full canopy. No line of sight from the ridge. It paused. The group is running a modified RL-12 jammer. It's surplus. Updated with components that were available commercially about 8 years ago. Their comms are their entire tactical picture. Take it down and they lose cohesion inside 3 minutes. I've seen it before. I helped design the original. A pause on the other end that might have been surprise and might have been recalibration. Copy Ridgeline. We need your local law enforcement to go dark. All non-essential comms off the air. Coordinate that? Give me 10 minutes. Ridgeline, the hostage. What's his status? He's alive. He's in the main structure, north end. It hurt him, because hurting him removes their leverage and they know it. They know it. They're scared, not stupid. Get there before that changes. Understood. Stand by. Adel set the headset down for a moment. He looked at his hands in the dark. They were an old man's hands now. The knuckles thickened, the skin looser than it used to be. Had used these hands to fix dock pilings and reglaze windows and pull winter trout out of this lake. He had used them before that for things he did not think about directly, epi fields. The way you don't look directly at a bright light. Not because they were shameful, exactly. Because some things were better carried in the peripheral vision of memory than examined straight on. Headset back on. He keyed the radio. 10 minutes confirmed. I'm out. He went to the back door of the house and walked across the dark yard to where Tremblay's cruiser sat at the edge of the property. He tapped on the window. Tremblay startled, held it down. I need you to get Sergeant Poulin, Walter said. Tell her to pull every radio in that command post off the air. Shut down the drone operations. Anything broadcasting on an active frequency. Off. Now. Tremblay stared at him. Yes, sir. Walter, I can't just. Tell her it's coming from Ridgeline. She'll understand what that means. If she doesn't, tell her to call Ottawa and use that word. They'll confirm. Tremblay reached for his radio, whatever was in Walter's voice. Not urgency, exactly, but a kind of absolute directional gravity. Made argument feel beside the point. Upper. At the command post, Fontaine received the request with the expression of a man who has been told his house is on fire and wants to discuss the source of the information. Delivered it without inflection and waited. She was good at waiting. On whose authority? Fontaine demanded. Ever. On the authority of someone who knows more about what's on that ridge than anyone currently in this building, she said. Inspector, I have spent 18 years reading people. On that dock. I don't know who he was before he came here, but I know what he is. Stand down your communications. Give him the room he's asking for. Fontaine looked around the room. The communications tech, Bergeron, was already looking at him with an expression that said he was willing to do whatever anyone decided as long as it was decided quickly. Something in Fontaine shifted. It was not comfortable, and it was not fast, but it moved. The specific internal movement of a smart person recognizing the edge of their competence and stepping back from it. All non-essential comms, offline, he said. Now. 22 minutes later, a convoy of vehicles arrived at the edge of Walter's property. They came without headlights. They came without noise that carried up in the gravel, and the doors opened. And figures stepped out with the coordinated efficiency of people who have rehearsed this particular moment in various configurations for a very long time. Tremblay counted them from the window of his cruiser and lost track after 30. He had never seen this many people appear from nowhere in such a short span of time. They moved like a single system. Each person a component, each component aware of the others. No motion wasted. Epshony festi does. Walter was on his front step. He watched them arrange themselves across his property with the look of a man watching something he expected, which was perhaps the most unusual thing about the whole unusual evening. A figure broke from the group and walked toward him. She was younger than Walter, by perhaps 20 years, with the kind of stillness in her movement that comes from having been in enough situations that stillness is no longer an effort. Dusty fields. She wore no rank insignia that was visible, but she moved like rank, like the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself because it is legible in everything else. She stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at him. Ridgeline, she said. It wasn't a question. That's an old call sign, Walter said. Long memory. She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has no social use for indirection. I was briefed on the authentication in transit. Tango 77 hasn't been active since before I was running ops. Our archivists thought it was a ghost signal at first. A pause. Major Desjardins, JTF2. We have 2 teams plus support. Have a fire solution for us? JTF2. Joint Task Force 2. Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. Walter had known them by a different name, in a different configuration, in a different era. Some of the doctrine they used, he had helped write. Access is through the north end of my property, he said. I'll walk you to the opening. From there it runs straight for about 200 meters, then angles northwest. There's a creek crossing at the 400-meter mark. It's shallow, but the rocks are loose. Take it slow. He looked at her. Your primary objective is the main structure. North end. 1 hostage, non-mobile, probably on the floor. He paused. Jammer will be in the secondary building, the one with the corrugated roof. Take that down first, and they lose their eyes. Desjardins listened. She did not take notes, just ask him to repeat himself. The local inspector, Walter said. Fontaine. He's not a bad man. He just got here too fast and talked too soon. Try not to step on him more than you have to. Desjardins. Something moved at the corner of Desjardins' mouth that might, in a less operational context, have been a smile. Stay clean, she said. You have my word. She looked at him for another moment, not assessing exactly. Something more like recognition. The way you look at a photograph of someone you never met but feel you should know. You wrote the terrain analysis framework we still use in deep wilderness operations, she said. It's in the manual, attached, but there are people in my unit who've argued about the authorship for years. Walter looked out at his property, at the dark shapes of the teams arraying themselves with quiet purpose along the tree line. Tell them to stop arguing, he said. It was a committee effort. She nodded once. Then she put her hand out. He took it. The handshake was brief and complete. 2 people who understood exactly what they were communicating and did not need to elaborate. Actually, she turned and rejoined her teams. She spoke to them in low, quick bursts, and they began to move, into the tree line, up the dark slope of the property, and then gone, swallowed by the spruce and the dark the way water absorbs rain, leaving no trace of passage. Fontaine had driven down. He stood with Poulin and Tremblay at the edge of the gravel, watching the last of them disappear, own dusty fields. His face held an expression that would have been difficult to describe precisely. Something between professional reassessment and the specific humility of a person who has had a significant assumption corrected in a very short span of time. He walked to the bottom of the steps. Walter was still standing there. The yard was quiet again. The stars over the lake were very bright. Mr. Brooke, Fontaine said. He stopped. Started again. Enter. I owe you an apology for my conduct this afternoon. Dismissive. And I was wrong to be dismissive, and He stopped again. Walter looked at him for a moment. There was no sharpness in it. You had a job to do, Walter said. You were working with the information you had. Next time, spend a bit longer talking to the people who live where you're operating. Not to manage them, just to listen. He paused. People who've been somewhere for a long time generally know something worth knowing. Fontaine nodded. He seemed to want to say more, but had perhaps run out of ways to say it. Go get warm, Walter said. It's going to be a few hours. It was, in the end, closer to 2, as the night was quiet in the way that nights are quiet when something has been carefully removed from them. The command post went dark at Poulin's instruction. The radio stayed off. The ridge was black against a sky that was doing the slow work of turning from navy to the faint gray that precedes morning. At 2:17 a.m., a single transmission came through on the channel Walter had left open. Ridgeline, this is Desjardins. Objective complete. Hostage recovered, ambulatory, minor exposure, no other injuries. Hostiles secured, no friendly casualties. We are clean. Walter pressed the key one final time. Received. Yes, Major. Thank you, Ridgeline. A pause. And then, with something in her voice that had not been there in the operational communications. It was an honor. He set down the headset. He sat in the dark for a moment. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood looking out the window at the lake, which was beginning to show the first gray light of early morning on its surface. Sergeant Poulin found him there. An hour later, when she came to tell him that Gilles Parenteau had been taken to hospital in Saint-Donat, he was cold and shaken, and would need a few days, but was otherwise whole, and that his wife had arrived at the hospital and had, according to the attending nurse, several things not suitable for official report, before beginning to cry. Walter listened to all of this. He nodded, as a hare. He poured her a cup of tea without asking if she wanted one, which she did. They stood in the kitchen for a while without speaking, which was something Poulin had always found comfortable rather than awkward. The silence of two people who did not need to fill space with noise. "I'm not going to ask," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I should know." She stopped, chose her words. "Whatever you were, whatever you did. It mattered tonight. He's going home to his family." Walter wrapped both hands around his mug. He looked at the lake. The light was coming up now, the water going from gray to the pale silver that preceded blue. "That's the only part that matters," he said. "The rest of it was a long time ago." She finished her tea. She thanked him, though she wasn't entirely sure for what, which seemed like the right amount of uncertainty. In the end, she drove back to the command post, where Fontaine was already on a call with Ottawa, that she suspected would be long and would involve a great deal of careful language. Builds. Constable Tremblay stopped by around 8, ostensibly to check on things, but really because he was 29 years old and had spent the night watching something he didn't have the context to understand, and felt the need to be near someone who did. Walter was back on the dock, same rod, same posture, unhurried attention to the surface of the water. Tremblay walked out and stood beside him. "You going to tell me anything?" he asked. "Probably not," Walter said. Tremblay considered this. Fair enough. He shoved his hands in his jacket pockets. "That fence at the back of your property, where the trail goes in. The teams took out 2 posts coming through in the dark." "I know," said Walter. "I'll fix it this afternoon." They stood together in the morning cold. The lake was flat and silver and immense. A loon called from somewhere toward the far shore, its sound carrying perfectly in the still air, rising and falling and fading like a story told to no one in particular. Walter Brooke reeled in his line. He rebaited it, slowly, carefully, with the same attention he brought to everything, cast it back out. The lure hit the water and disappeared into the silver, leaving only the smallest circle, which spread outward and then was gone. It was just a man fishing on a dock in the Laurentians. He had been for 12 years and intended to be for however many remained. The world had found him once, as it occasionally did, had sent its trouble to his mountain, to his valley, to the edge of his lake, and he had dealt with it in the only way that made sense, which was quietly, completely, and without leaving anything unfinished. The loon called again. Walter listened to it. The cold came off the water and he did not mind it. Some men spend their whole lives becoming something. Walter Brooke had spent the last 12 years becoming nothing in particular, which was, he had decided, the harder and more valuable achievement. He watched the line and waited, patient as the lake itself, for whatever the morning would bring.